Hello and welcome to a video summarising all the key quotes to memorise for the Power and Conflict anthology. My name is Barbara and in this video I'll give you a quick run through of all the main quotes, context and structure points that you need to memorise for your Power and Conflict exams. Now, the anthology has 15 poems, which is a lot, so I've limited the quotes to remember per poem to just 2 quotations. I'll show you how you can get the most out of each of the 2 quotations per poem, and for each poem I'll show you the kind of word level analysis you need to remember, as well as of course context. So let's begin. Now, the first poem in this collection is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. In terms of a structure, it's written in sonnet form, and contextually, and do bear in mind of course my notes are very shorthand. He's a romantic poet and he wrote the poem after an Italian explorer found a statue in the desert. Now, the first quotation to remember is half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown. Now, in this quotation, you have caesura, so of course after sunk and lies, you have enjambment, and you also have the violent verbs. Of course, enjambment is at the end of frown, and the violent verb is shattered. Now, the second quotation to remember before you move on is King of Kings, ellipsis, then you select colossal wreck, boundless and bare. In this quotation, what you need to bear in mind is there's hyperbole, caesura, repetition and alliteration included. Now, for the second poem in this collection, it's London by William Blake. Now, structurally, do remember that it's written in 4 quatrains, quatrains being 4-line stanzas, and it has a very consistent rhyming pattern, an A-B rhyming pattern. Contextually, do bear in mind that William Blake was a radical romantic poet who questioned church teachings and believed in the French Revolution. So he was hinting in this poem that perhaps the UK and London, when we think about the monarchy, needed its own similar revolution. Now, the first quotation to remember is marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, this is really a good quote to remember because you can talk about repetition, which is present in this, so repetition of marks, you have alliteration, and you also have the semantic field of suffering, weakness and woe. The second quote to remember is curse, ellipsis, blights with plagues the marriage hearse. And of course, this one, you have a rhyming couplet, curse, at the end of the previous line, and it rhymes with hearse. You have oxymoron, marriage, hearse and assonance of I. The third poem in this collection is The Prelude by Wordsworth. Now, in terms of structure, it's written in 1 stanza and it's a dramatic monologue. Now, contextually, Wordsworth himself, again, much like Shelley and Blake, was a romantic poet from the Lake District, and this is a semi-autobiographical poem published after his death. The first quotation to remember and to memorize is, she was an elf in penance, lustily. Now, in this quotation, you want to focus on, firstly, personification of the boat, secondly, metaphor, thirdly, caesura, and the fourth thing is enjambment after lustily. The second quote to memorize for this poem is the horizons bound, a huge peak, black and huge. Here you have caesura after bound as well as peak. You have repetition as well as alliteration. Now, for the next poem in this collection, My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Firstly, remember that the structure is it's written in 1 stanza and it's a dramatic monologue. And contextually, it's based on the Italian Duke Alfonso, the Italian Duke of Ferrara in Italy, whose wife died in very suspicious circumstances. Now, the first quotation to memorize is paint, ellipsis, faint, and then the next line, and of course here I've put a forward slash because there is no quotation in enjambment, then half flush that dies along her throat. So this quotation is paint, ellipsis, faint, half flush that dies along her throat. In terms of word level analysis, focus on the fact that you have the rhyming couplet, so paint and faint, you have enjambment, and also of course you've got death imagery, dies. The second quotation to remember for this poem is, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Now, in terms of technique, you want to focus on the sibilance, alliteration, the euphemism, and euphemism is a polite way to refer to something which is terrible. In this instance, it's death. All smiles stopped together is a polite way of saying that he basically had his duchess killed. And finally, the assonance of E in this quotation. Now, the next poem in this collection, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Alfred Tennyson. Now, structurally, this poem is written in 6 stanzas, and contextually, you want to remember that this poem is a tribute to the men who died in the Battle of Balaclava in 1854, which was part of the Crimean War. The first quote to remember is Into the Valley of Death. Now, Firstly, this is a Psalm 23 reference. Yeah, I'll walk through the valley of the shadow of death in the Bible. The second element for this quotation to remember is the repetition in 3 stanzas. So the into the valley of death is repeated 3 times within the poem. Moreover, you've got enjambment at the end of death and of course assonance of E. The second quotation to memorize is canon to the right of them, canon to the left of them, canon behind them. Now for this quotation, you want to focus on repetition. You also have alliteration and you have violent imagery, the cannons, which are going to, of course, kill these men. Now, the next poem in the collection is Exposure, and this is of course by Wilfred Owen. Remember, structurally it's written in 8 stanzas, and contextually Wilfred Owen was a war poet, and he of course died during the First World War, and this poem itself was written in the trenches of World War I, not long before he was killed in battle. The first quotation to remember is merciless iced east winds that knife, and the techniques to remember in the word level analysis is you've got personification in this quotation, so of course the winds are personified, you have enjambment at the end of knife, and sibilant sounds with S. The second quotation is slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fire's glows. Now here you have metaphor, so he's describing the men metaphorically as ghosts. You've got caesura, after drag home, and of course alliteration. Now the next poem in the collection is Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney, and here you have it's written in 1 stanza in terms of structure. Now contextually, do bear in mind that Heaney in this poem is recalling his childhood in Northern Ireland, and this poem could arguably be an extended metaphor for Northern Ireland's troubles. Now the first quotation to remember is we are prepared, we build our houses squat. Here in this quotation you want to remember that there's alliteration used. You've got caesura after prepared and the verb, so building, being prepared. Now the second quotation is spits like a tamed cat, next line, turn savage, and of course I've put the / to indicate that there's no punctuation after cat, meaning firstly in terms of technique you're focusing on structure, enjambment, simile like a tamed cat to describe the sea, and the third thing is oxymoron. Okay, so tame and savage, these are opposite words. The next poem in this collection is Bene Charge by Ted Hughes, and structurally bear in mind that this poem is written in 3 stanzas, and contextually just remember that Hughes's father himself served in and survived the First World War, so of course this could be influenced by his father's tale to Hughes. The first quotation to bear in mind and to memorize is bullets smacking the belly out of the air, and here word level analysis you want to do is alliteration, personification, and the assonance of E. Now the second quotation to remember is king, honor, human dignity, etc. This listing, meaning firstly in terms of structure you've got ascendantic listing here. You also have the semantic field of patriotism, king, honor, human dignity, and the final thing is alliteration. Now the next poem is Remains by Simon Armitage. Structurally remember that this was written in 8 stanzas, 7 of which are quatrains, so 7 of which are 4-line stanzas, and the final is 2-line stanzas. Bear in mind that this poem is based on the account of a British soldier who's supposed to be the narrator, who served in perhaps Iraq, and they are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the effects that usually counters and comes after being and serving in a very traumatic situation like a war. Now the 2 quotes to remember, firstly, I see every round as it rips through his life, and in this instance you want to talk about in terms of word level analysis, alliteration, hyperbole, and the assonance of I. And the second quotation to memorize is when he ends by saying his bloody life in my bloody hands. Now here you have repetition of course of bloody, alliteration, but also especially if you're studying Macbeth by Shakespeare, hopefully you have picked up on the reference to Lady Macbeth's insanity when she sees out damned spot, and of course this links to PTSD. He's seeing blood on his hands like Lady Macbeth saw spots of blood on her hands, but of course this blood isn't actually on his hands. This is showing that he's hallucinating, he's experiencing PTSD. The next poem is Poppies by Jane Vere. Now in terms of structure it's written in 4 stanzas, and contextually this poem, just bear in mind, it was commissioned by the poet laureate, so the speaker's persona also is a mother. Now the first quotation to remember and to memorize is all my words, next line, flattened, rolled, turned into felt, and of course I've put a / there to indicate that this is in the next line, but there's no punctuation, so there's enjambment, so that's a structure point. The other thing from this quotation to bear in mind is rule of 3, flattened, rolled, turned to felt, and alliteration. Now the second quotation to memorize is I traced inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. Now here you have simile, alliteration, and the assonance of I. The next poem is War Photographer by Caroline Duffy. Now, structurally, it's written in 4 stanzas, which are sestet. Remember, a sestet is a 6-line stanza. Now, contextually, you should remember that this poem was inspired by Duffy, so the poet's own friendship with the war photographer, and she was really intrigued by the challenges he faced. Now, the first quotation to remember is Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. Now, there's a rule of 3 listing capital cities, or rather cities that have experienced war. Bear in mind, Belfast is in Northern Ireland, Beirut is in Lebanon, and Phnom Penh is in Cambodia. And of course, it then says all flesh is grass, which is a metaphor, and you have alliteration of B. The second quotation is 100 agonies in black and white. Now here, word level analysis to focus on is firstly hyperbole, 100, enjambment, which is at the end of white, and oxymoron, black and white. Now the next poem by MTS Darker, Tissue. So bear in mind structurally, it's written in 10 stanzas, 9 of which are quatrains, 4-line stanzas, and the final is just a single line. Contextually, you could argue that MTS Darker looks at the troubles of the modern world, and she remarks on how nothing is meant to last. Now, in terms of quotations to memorize, the first is maps to, full stop, the sun shines through. Now here you have caesura after to. You also have sibilance, sun shines, and enjambment after through. The second quotation is paper smooth and stroked and thinned to be transparent. Now here you have rule of 3, smooth, stroked, thinned, alliteration, as well as assonance of O. Now, the following poem in the collection is the Emigre. Now here, this poem is written in 3 stanzas, and the context is the poet, or rather the author of this poem, is very well traveled, and she's particularly interested in different cultural identities, so she explores this within this poem. Now, the first quotation to remember and to memorize is the once was a country, ellipsis, I left it as a child. Now, firstly, the ellipsis, which is in the actual poem, okay, so it's not my own addition, the ellipsis is in the poem. Of course, this gives it like a very fairy tale opening. Secondly, you have enjambment at the end of child, and also alliteration. So bear in mind that this opening, and this is taken from the first line of the first stanza, it opens and it starts like a fairy tale. The second quotation to memorize is my city hides behind me, full stop, the mutter death. And the word level analysis you want to do here is personification. Structure is caesura after me, and then assonance of E. Now, the next poem in the collection is Checking Out My History by John Agard. Now here, the structure is it's written in 10 stanzas, and it has refrains, almost like a verse, and these are written in italics to stand out. Now, contextually, bear in mind that John Agard, he was a Guyanese British poet. He is a Guyanese British poet, and he criticizes in this poem British colonial education. Now, the first quotation to memorize is when the speaker states, bandage up my eye with my own history. Now here you have metaphor, which is the person is bandaging their eye with history. You've got enjambment at the end of history. You also have repetition of someone feeling like they're being bandaged, and assonance of E. Now, the second quotation to memorize is them tell me about Florence Nightingale, ellipsis, that's my addition, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. So firstly, bear in mind that there's this parallelism. So 2 parallel figures, one white, one black. So Florence Nightingale is a very, very famous and well-remembered white British nurse who revolutionized nursing. However, Mary Seacole, who was also in the same Crimean War at that time, who was black Jamaican woman, is not remembered, but still she did quite a lot for the nursing profession during this time, in spite of facing lots of racism. So in terms of word level analysis, you want to remember for this quotation, remember there's repetition. You have proper nouns which contrast each other. So of course, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, there's parallelism as I mentioned, and of course finally the assonance of E. Now, the final poem in this collection is Kamikaze, and bear in mind that it's written in 7 stanzas structurally, and contextually this poem refers to the Japanese pilots who flew suicide attacks for Japan during World War II, and of course these suicide attacks were against the Allies, UK for instance, USA and so on. Now, the first quotation to memorize is fishes flashing silver as the belly swiveled towards the sun. Now here, word level analysis you want to do is the sibilance, alliteration, assonance of I, and war imagery, which is shown through silver. So we always associate, especially in war, silver with bullets. Now, the second quotation to memorize is they treated him as though he no longer existed. Now here, what you want to memorize is there's alliteration. There's also enjambment, which is at the end of existed. There is no punctuation. And finally, assonance of E. So that's all. If you found this video useful, don't forget we have an extensive English GCSE course packed with everything you need to know for the language and literature GCSE exams, plus lots of model answers that you can download with level 9 GCSE model answers that you can read and figure out and see how to write top responses to both the language and literature exams. Thank you so much for listening.